in 2023. My name is Nicole, and I'm the newest team member at Women's Empowerment Principles, Global Secretariat at the UN Women. And before I start, I want to try launching a quick poll. And I hope that everyone can fill this out as we go through further introductions. And so earlier this year, we covered different themes related to gender equality, such as legal frameworks to support women entrepreneurs and insights from investors on companies working on advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. And for today's webinar, we're going to be taking a step to understand how our brain works through delving into unconscious bias. We have invited a very special guest from one of our WEP signatory companies, Hexagon, and I will introduce her after opening remarks from Anna Falth, the global head of the WEP Secretariat here at UN Women. And today's workshop is for you. So we have tried to make it as interactive as possible, and we prepared some questions for you to answer. So please, for those who have just joined, fill out the poll, and you can also use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will later be uploaded to weps.org to share with the general public. And to get us started, I would like to invite Mihwa Park, the WEPs coordinator at UN Women, to deliver the opening remarks. So Mihwa, the floor is yours.
No, thank you, Nicole. Before I go on with my remarks, I wanted to see the poll and I know people are replying, so I wanted to end and share results with us so that you can see who's joining and what is their professional roles. So with that said, thank you and welcome everyone to the last edition of this WEPs Deep Dive series in 2023. And thanks for joining us today during the busy season of closing out the year. For many of us, 2023 went by in a blink of a second. I don't know if you can resonate with myself. And also a very special thanks to our speaker from Hexagon, one of our active WEP signatories. It's our great pleasure to have you here, Nancy, and offer the session to the Global WEPs Network. So earlier this year, the Global WEPs Secretariat at UN Women launched this deep dive series to offer you WEP signatories and WEP sponsors or WEP supporters deeper insights on various topics related to gender equality and women's empowerment from the perspective of our partners. So you may recall that the first guest speaker, the World Bank, has addressed legal frameworks that are conducive for women in business and how companies can go beyond compliance with the law to accelerate the progress on gender equality and women's empowerment in the workplace, marketplace, and community. Then the second deep dive features institutional investors offering insights to how they are investing with a gender lens by paying increased attention to their investees, companies, progress on gender equality indicators, and how they are impacting companies' operations and thereby advancing gender equality. We'll share the link to the recording in the chat for those who may have missed these sessions later on. And today we are hosting the third and the last session of the series in 2023. We will be back in 2024 with additional deep dive series, and we'll share the tentative topics at the end of the session. If you're interested in offering your company's experience, perspective, or insight to any of these topics, please let us know. Today, we'd like to take a broader perspective about how our brain works. Why are we as humans creating a society that is gender unequal, full of biases and stereotypes? Where or in what is the systematic discrimination rooted? Why will we only achieve gender equality in 300 years at the current rate? Our speaker will tell you more details that our brain is susceptible to bias. Even the most open-minded person has unconscious bias. Biases may be held by an individual or a group and can have important or even serious consequences. Unconscious biases are created and reinforced by our experiences, attitudes, and the environment around us. Our mind is constantly processing information, and oftentimes without our conscious awareness. When we are moving too fast or lack of complete information or data, our unconscious bias fill in the gap influencing everything from product decisions to our interactions with your coworkers. If you act according to your unconscious bias, you limit your potential opportunities. Well, this workshop is designed to showcase what bias is, how and where it shows up, and what you can do about it. We will go a little deeper into this topic throughout this session, and you will learn more about it. So before I hand it over to our guest speaker today, I'd like to give you some food for thought for you on how unconscious bias could be linked to how our society works through social and gender norms. So as the latest UN Women report on social norms, gender, and development pointed out, there has been a major progress toward gender equality and the realization of women's rights in the past century, from women's increased participation in paid work and access to income to the condition of violence, to the codification, of violence against women as a human rights abuse in international and national laws, to more women in political office and increased access to sexual and reproductive health care, and more. These gains are the result of many factors, including women's mobilization, labor movement, and changes in the economy, among others. At the same time, backlash against women's progress has been on the rise in countries around the world, threatening to undo hard-won gains. In the spheres of life and others, social and gender norms are widely accepted as influencing and being influenced by progress and pushback on gender equality. Social and gender norms can and do change, but with the current norms in most parts of the world, women are far away from enjoying full and equal rights with men and fully enjoying financial and digital access and more. Now you've heard it many, many times that it will take 300 years to achieve full gender equality if we were to remain at the current speed. Once someone said, the world is formed as how we made up of it. Thus, we, the creators of this world, are who can also change that. I hope today's session will be an eye-opener for you to make that change, and maybe it can be your New Year resolution. Thank you, and over to Nicole to introduce our speaker of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihwa, for those wonderful opening remarks. I'll stop sharing the poll for now, but throughout the session we'll have more, and I hope that everyone can keep engaging as they've done so wonderfully. So now I will welcome Nancy Rose, the Senior Director at the People and Culture team at Hexagon. And to briefly introduce Nancy to you, of course, she is a global leader in clean energy solutions. Her role is to work closely with leaders and teams across the organization to ensure a diverse and inclusive working environment, allowing personal and professional development, healthy retention, and the attraction of new talent. Prior to joining Hexagon, she spent 13 years at Stryker, creating and delivering global leadership programming, eventually leading the learning and development team for North and South America. And Nancy has extensive experience working with leaders from all backgrounds and experience levels. And while she has worked with leaders from around the globe, the most important future leaders she hopes to develop are her sons, Jack, Will, and Teddy. So thanks again, Nancy, for being here with us today and for taking the opportunity to lead this session. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Nicole, to Anna and Mihwa. Thank you all. It's very much an honor to be here. So appreciate the warm introduction, and I will share my screen with you. Okay. There we go. All right. Thank you so much again for the introduction. What an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you today on this global call. Appreciate seeing all of the places that you are dialing in from. I am here in Michigan in the United States. And this topic of unconscious bias is something I've been with since around 2017. I was working for a global organization who had prioritized this topic as the #1 leadership development topic on the minds of our leaders. This program was put together with a global team to ensure that it had a global lens, that it had a global view, and that the topic was relevant worldwide. So through research and partnerships, this content was pulled together. This is a modified version for this program, but I have taught this as a full half-day workshop for organizations around the globe to really understand this topic of unconscious bias. And so I'm honored to be here in support of the Women's Empowerment Principles. They say that the best way to retain new information is to teach others. And I have taught this course many times, and I have listened and learned from participants in many, many different countries. And I can say the impact it's had on me as a facilitator is very big. I'm not perfectly unbiased, and we will never be, but that's simply not the goal. The goal is to be more curious, to seek deeper understanding from others, and question our assumptions far more regularly than we do before. The topic of unconscious bias is an important first step because this understanding paves the way for very critical conversations around anti-racism, gender equality, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And so with that, we're going to do a little warm up. So we know that bias lives in your brain. If you have a brain, you have bias. And so we're going to warm up our brains a little bit and just take a look at this topic a little more closely. Sitting on your shoulders is your brain. And your brain is one of the most complicated objects in the known universe. There's so much we understand about it, and yet so much that we do not. But we know that it's the central command to our thoughts, our feelings, our perspectives, our behavior. And so the more we understand where all of those things came from, the more we can adjust our behavior. So we're going to give this a little bit of a test. So in a moment, I'm going to show you a collage filled with images, all different images. And I'm going to give everybody on this call about 20 to 30 seconds to just stare at the collage. Just look at it. Just look at it. And then after that time, I'm going to advance back. And I want you to see how many things you can remember. So if you have a pen and paper, you could write it down after I advanced back. We want to see how tuned your brain is to the images that it sees. So pen and paper down, you're going to look at an image, and then I'm going to advance back, and you're going to write down all the things that you can remember, or just see in your head how many images you remember. All right, you ready? Here we go. Here's the image. So I'm going to give you now about 25 seconds. Just look at it. Don't write anything down. Stare at the images. And when time is up, I want to see how many things you remember. All right. How many things do you remember from that collage? Start writing things down or start listing things in your head. If you want to use the chat, you can chat in how many things that you recall. But take a few seconds now and just think, how many things did you remember on that slide? And here is the image again. When I teach this class globally, I've had people remember everything from 5 things, maybe 10 things. And depending on the audience, they remember very different things. Now look at this collage for a moment. You see all different types of images. And maybe now as you look at it again, you think, oh, I forgot the fish, or oh yeah, the flag was there. This collage is really important in our understanding of what bias is. Bias simply means that I don't see the world as it is. I see the world as I am. And the things that I remember tend to be more grounded in my own culture, in my own experience. As an example, you see in the lower right side of the screen, there's a Sri Lankan flag. When I have taught this class in countries with close proximity to Sri Lanka, how many people do you think remembered that flag? Everybody in the class will raise their hand and say they remembered that flag. The farther away the participant is from Sri Lanka, the less they are likely to remember that flag or even identify what it means. Similar to objects like the Golden Gate Bridge, the cyber texture egg in Mumbai, if that is something that you see, it's something that's part of your community, your brain will remember it. It will grab onto it and it will remember it. But the farther away anything is from your own understanding, our brain struggles with that. We struggle to remember it. We struggle to make sense of it. This is where diversity becomes so critical within any organization or group of people coming together to work on something. I will likely never find the one individual who could look at this collage and memorize it and think and have a connection to every object on here. That's really not the point, is it? It's about bringing a group together who remember different parts, who bring their own perspectives, and together the group sees a much bigger picture. And yet we tend to be drawn to people that see things the way we see things. I saw the bright yellow lemon fruit, and you saw the bright yellow lemon fruit, and now we have a connection. There's a connection there. But I may struggle with those who see things, frankly, differently than me. But the beauty of diversity is bringing those perspectives together. And yet that's a challenge for us, which is what we're going to discuss in this program. So let's further warm your brains up. You're doing great. Now I'm going to walk you through a series of images, and I'm going to ask you to make a choice. You don't put anything in the chat. You don't need to write anything down. This is simply for you to reflect on. So know that your choices that you're about to make when I ask you to make a choice are the product of many years of experiences. These experiences have formed a lens through which you see the world, and it allows you to make very quick decisions. Okay, so for each image, you're just going to make a choice silently to yourself. The first thing I'd like you to do is choose the dessert. Which food is the dessert? Now, of these three, choose the home. Now choose the pet, the pest, and the food. Now for these three, choose the caregiver for your children. For these, which one is the surgeon? The doctor. Which one is the secretary or administrative assistant? Who is the chief executive officer or CEO? Well, we'll pause on this one. These are all CEOs. But if you've been a member of any of the Fortune 500 companies, you may have looked closely at the first photo. And why is that? Well, in 1980, all of the top 50 Fortune 500 companies, CEOs were white males. In 2023, 37 of the top 50 companies' CEOs were white men. In 2023, the CEOs of the top 50 Fortune 500 companies included 6 white women, 1 Hispanic Latino man, 1 Hispanic Latina woman, 3 South Asian men, 1 Black man, 1 Black woman. So what does this all mean in terms of where your brain settles in? I just asked you to do something uncomfortable. Make a choice about something or someone without very much information. And yet, if we go back, our brain does that pretty easily. When I ask you to choose the dessert, depending on what culture you've come from and where you've grown up, one of these objects looks a lot like dessert. For me, it's the chocolate cake right in the middle. That looks like dessert to me, and my brain knows that. And further, if we go to this slide and I ask you to choose the home, now people could certainly live in caves, people could live in boats, but again, from my understanding, I immediately look at the house. And the house to me, excuse me, says home. Now things start to get a little more complicated. And as we layer different cultures and regions into these decisions, things start to get a little complex. If you are a vegetarian or vegan, none of these animals are food. Depending on parts of the world, all three could be food. And in other parts of the world, they may be pets that you would have and you would never think to eat them. And yet, we bring our own lens on. But it really gets the most uncomfortable when our brains sort of naturally make quick decisions about people. And based on your own experience and what you have seen through movies, television, the media, advertising, our brains sort of naturally land on one face that feels like the right choice. And it could be because that's my own experience. I have seen doctors or surgeons who typically look a certain way. And while our brain may, on a second thought, say, well, it could be all three, but it really feels like the one to me. That's really the product of bias. Now, the good news is our brain has the ability to expand and allow more in. You're not the same person that you were when you were a child. You have grown, you have matured. So we have the ability to rewrite the story that our brain tells us that the only home is the house. When you meet somebody who lives on a boat, all of a sudden your brain rewrites that story a bit. But this is challenging because that first thought is very powerful, especially when it relates to people. And so we must understand when we enter this conversation of bias and what bias is. Bias is simply a product of your own lived experiences. If you have grown up seeing a certain type of person and a certain type of role, it becomes easy to continue to bring that type of person in for that role. If you have always worked with one vendor or one contractor and you have a good experience, it's very difficult to consider why you would renegotiate or why you would look beyond that. These experiences form the lens through which we see the world, and these lenses form biases, perceptions, and ultimately our reality. So when Mihwa says it's a 300-year journey, if we don't make some intentional moves, this is why those first thoughts and those decades and centuries of programming are quite powerful. Now, as uncomfortable as it can be to acknowledge that we have bias, I want you to keep something in mind. You are not responsible for your first thought. That first thought that says, well, chocolate cake is dessert, and that person looks like the surgeon to me, based on my experience. You're not responsible for that first thought that maybe immediately when I say I went to the doctor yesterday, you might immediately imagine a man. Or you might imagine a man when I say engineer, but when I say teacher or nurse, oftentimes our first thought is female. That first thought is not something that you are directly responsible for. It comes through all of those years of lived experience. But the most important part of bias education is this second part. You are responsible for your second thought and your first action. And that is where our power lies to really change the story, right? If my first thought is, well, that must be the surgeon. And then I take a step back and say, why did I think that? Couldn't the surgeon be that person or that person? Our brain has the ability to open up that lens. So today we're going to do an overview of what bias is, how it shows up, and what we can do about it through action planning. We'll talk about the seeds of bias, which is a framework for understanding. We'll talk about the story cycle, which is how biases tend to continue to be pervasive. And we'll look at micro messages. Agreements when you go into bias training, and I've taught this class live as a workshop many times, and it is important that we have shared agreements in a program, that we listen actively and attentively, and certainly that we are patient and compassionate with ourselves and others. All of us have bias. All of us have prejudgments and notions that live in our brain. So we must work towards shared understanding and ask for clarification. And certainly to speak from our own experience, which is very powerful. And when I teach this class within a classroom, keeping the conversation confidential allows for that open exchange of dialogue. So we've talked a lot about what bias is, right? It's this shortcut. Bias is a mental shortcut that results in judgment without question. It results in your ability to make a very fast decision about something. Unconscious bias creates automatic associations without awareness, intention, or control. These often conflict with our conscious attitudes, behaviors, and intentions. If you say engineer or doctor, and I imagine a man in my head as a first thought, consciously I know that many other women, men are in these professions, and yet that first thought is still there. So it's about that second thought, because that's really where the power lies to challenge. But let's look at what these biases are. Bias isn't in and of itself a bad thing. It is not a negative thing. It's a biological process of our brain that allows us to think fast. But in a very hyper-connected global world where poor decisions that we make can have massive impact, and we know this as signatories to WEPs, that the decisions we make about advancement and development and growth of our organizations can certainly help move us forward or set us back. This conversation of bias has never been more important. Human biases occur outside of our conscious awareness. Consciously, we know the right thing often, but subconsciously, our brain is really wired by those patterns. And so, how can we then combat those negative effects of bias? Collectively, organizationally. We cannot do this simply as individuals. The power comes in a group or a team coming together to understand this, be aware of it, acknowledge that it exists within ourselves, and make a plan together to move forward. But the first step is to identify the types of biases. To that end, the Neuro Leadership Institute took the 150 or so known common biases and grouped them into 5 categories, really based on their underlying nature. And so that spells out an acronym called SEEDS. And so what we're going to do is go through each one so we really understand what these biases are. And as we do, hopefully you see some recognition here that you say, oh, I can see how I might have some of that bias. I see that now. So the first in the seeds of bias is similarity bias. What does that mean? Well, people like me are better than others. And we automatically define everyone as in group or out group. So you may hold a relatively positive perception of people who are similar to you, your friends, your family, the people who you share a close connection with. And on a subconscious level, you may have a very negative perception of those who are different, the out group, those who look different, think differently, hold a different political perspective, have grown up in a much different place than we are. We automatically put people in our in group or out group. And even when you're not aware that these things are happening, they are reflected in your behavior. So again, you are more likely to hire in-group members, people who are like you, people who have a similar background. And once you hire them, we are more likely to give them bigger budgets, bigger raises, more promotions. So unconsciously, we are giving an advantage to people that are in the in-group. So as you can imagine, the more decision makers we have, that are hiring people like them, you see where this becomes very challenging if we don't have processes in place to stop that. And so, how do we do that? The best way to mitigate similarity bias is to find commonalities with those who appear different. We have to have diverse slates of vendors, of candidates, of leaders. We have to look at that comprehensively because we can't change your bias of preference for the in group. We're always going to have that preference, that connection to the people like us, but you can bring more people into that affiliation. So if I have a bias for people like me, my challenge as a leader is to find things I have in common with the people in the out group to bring them in, to create that space where everybody can find that connection and that sense of belonging. So the question for you, and we have these in a poll that you can answer, and we'll collect some of these examples because it's certainly helpful as we think about how does a bias like that disrupt our efforts around gender equality. So what are some examples of similarity bias that disrupt gender equality efforts? So again, we bring people in the in-group. How could similarity bias disrupt what we're trying to do around gender equality? So you can type in a short answer. It could be a process that you've seen this play out. Again, perhaps hiring somebody. Do you know of a leader who hires people very similar to that leader? Do you see teams that you work with that tend to be made up of a very similar type of person? These are things that typically happen on a subconscious level. And yet over time, as you can see, they form now a pattern that becomes very hard to disrupt. So take some time to share your thoughts on similarity bias, and we'll keep that poll open for just a bit. And I see some answers coming in, which is excellent. Thank you. Your answers and your examples certainly help all of us understand these biases more directly. We know they exist, but how they show up can sometimes be mysterious unless we're looking for them. And again, as organizations, we have to look at how, if we can't take bias out of our brains, how do we take bias out of our processes? How do we make sure that the same decision makers that we make sure that the decision makers are being challenged with diversity of thought and perspective? Okay. And Mihwa, I'll let you close the poll. You think we've got a good response rate, and we'll move on to the next one. So that's similarity bias. In-group is more powerful than out-group. So the challenge is to bring the out-group in. Next is expedience bias. This is our need for speed. Expedience bias helps us make quick, efficient decision. Expedience bias happens when we are overloaded and looking to make a quick decision without a lot of analysis. So what does our brain do? It just grabs onto the thing that's the most comfortable, that's the easiest available. I may have two candidates, a male and a female. The male candidate perhaps has a bit more experience, might be readier within the role. The female candidate might have a different set of experiences. Her onboarding to the organization may take a little bit more time, but the male is typically the type that I hire. So again, similarity bias and now expedience bias. I go with what's available to me. I want to make that quick decision. If it feels right, it must be true. So expedience bias is our brain's desire to go with what's available. Keep in mind, our brains are overwhelmed by constant streams of stimulus. The temperature in the room, if we're tired, if we're hungry, all of these things affect how our brain is able to do more higher order thinking. And so if our brain is overwhelmed, it wants to choose a quick path. That's what keeps us moving. But unfortunately, what that does is it often allows us to make faster decisions without enough careful analysis. So we tend to take that decision, really drill it down to something very simple without a lot of analysis, evaluation, and then we make a decision. So a sales rep, as an example, somebody's in sales or a consultant or somebody that you're working with may automatically use a familiar solution. Everything is always this solution. Instead of really listening to the client's or patient's problems, they could be suffering from availability bias. So your brain thinks, oh, there's a lot that I need to understand here. Let's just go with this decision and hope that it works out. And what do we find out often? It wasn't the right decision. And we have to go back and redo the work. So if you've ever been in a situation where you just launched something quickly and then had to go back and really do more analysis and get it done the right way, this is expedience bias at play. And so what do we do with expedience bias? We have to move quickly, right? We do need to make sure that we keep processes and things moving. And yet without careful analysis, we know that often we have to go back. So what we do about that is we have to provide incentives for people to step off the easier path, right? So if we are awarding teams and recognizing teams who do things very quickly all the time, but yet we haven't taken that step back to see if they're really executing the right way, if they've given it enough analysis, if they're really moving us beyond where we've always been, we need to create incentives for people to do that work. So we need to create incentives for teams to challenge themselves and others by identifying their own mistakes, fostering a culture that encourages this. So acknowledging that a team has spent a good amount of time on a problem, really digging in, analyzing, incentivizing the thought process that allows us to be more comprehensive and challenge that bias. But if we constantly award speed and fast, oftentimes we're not building very good long-term solutions. So this might mean you might relax a deadline to consider more alternatives and allow that to be okay. I know we wanted to launch this Monday, but I feel we're missing a perspective at this table. Let's pause. Let's make sure we bring the right voices together before we launch this. It could be the salesperson or the doctor that you're seeing with. You're asking them to really lay out the logic of the approach step by step. So as a patient, I might ask my doctor to really give me a more thorough explanation to make sure that they're not just going with, the quick diagnosis. And so you may also break a problem into smaller parts, involve a wider group of people, and recognize those who do, who take that time to really make sure we're being thoughtful and bringing the right people in. So our next poll question, expedience bias. This causes us to want to move quickly and with minimal information. How might this disrupt our gender equality efforts when our brains love that short, quick decision? How does that disrupt some of the things that we're trying to do? And as you think about how it's disrupting your organization, not really taking the analysis in, not bringing the right voices to the table, also be thinking about, are you unintentionally rewarding that behavior by having very fast deadlines, by not challenging your teams and your leaders to really walk through the analysis? Oftentimes we can unintentionally reward the wrong behavior. And this is an example where we see this quite often. I see again, great answers coming in. Thank you. It helps to understand where these things are showing up, because the fact is these are products of our brain. So if we know where they're showing up, we as an organization, or you with your organizations, can start making plans to challenge them. We'll give it just a little bit more time before I move on. But yes, thank you for your answers. It'll be good for all of us to look at those and add more examples to the program. Moving from expedience bias to experience bias, which says that my perceptions are accurate. The way I have lived my life becomes my truth, and everything else that's different than that becomes strange, or again, outgroup, right? If my experience makes me who I am, I tend to like other people with that experience. You start to see how these work together. Experience bias wires our brain to believe that the way we've experienced the world is reality. So if I've grown up with dogs as pets, and I see a culture that has dogs as food, or I am a vegetarian or vegan and I see somebody eating meat, right? That experience bias that says that I've experienced the world, I feel right, I assign that behavior as wrong. And so this allows us to kind of form a truth. The human brain has evolved to regard our own perceptions as complete. So people tend to assume that what they see is all there is to see. Now, your perceptions, your experience is accurate. It is your experience. The fact is, though, it is not comprehensive to everybody's experience. And so you can see this becomes challenging when you bring people of opposing viewpoints together who really believe that they're right. Where do you go from there? Well, again, similar to the similarity bias, we have to look for those places of connection and shared experiences so that we can move forward. So these are troublesome when they breed misunderstanding at work, or with any group. If you hold a strong conviction as reality and you assume that anybody who sees things differently is wrong. And so we have to really challenge this as organizations and really look at our shared values, our shared commitments, and build a place where we can experience things the same way and that we can bring all of our experiences to the team. So how do we combat experience bias? This is challenging, right? Because it's my experience. It becomes my teacher and it becomes the way I see the world, that lens. Experience biases respond very favorably to an organizational approach. We have to put systems into place that minimize their influence. And so what this means is you may set up practices for routinely seeking opinions from people who are not on the team or the project. Meaning, if we're in a group of people, we have been looking at this problem forever. We have our own experiences with it. We have our own challenges with it. And we may unintentionally be designing a solution that only accommodates our experiences with the challenge, right? And so we have to bring other people in who are not on that team, who have a different experience. Other techniques include revisiting ideas after a break to see them with new eyes. You'll have a more objective light, setting time aside to look at yourself and your message through other people's eyes. What I'm saying is, if I think that this is the solution, I have to have other people look at it and say, interesting solution. I don't know that it connects to me, so let's talk about it. And then being willing to have that conversation. So experience bias that says experience is our teacher. What are some examples of an experience bias in the workplace that disrupts gender equality efforts? Meaning my experience is reality. I don't question it because it's my reality. It's what I've known. How might this be a place where gender equality efforts become disruptive if we see that our experiences, our own experiences, are the only ones coming to the table to solve the problem? And often that's what it is. As we're looking at the poll, one example, within the medical device space, oftentimes if you are a male engineer and you are designing tools for a surgeon, you may be designing tools for a certain hand, right? And then what we find is that people with different abilities, people with different hands, size, shape, have a hard time with your tools. So again, we design solutions often unconsciously because of our own experiences with them. And we often don't think that I need to be designing a program or a goal or an objective that addresses a lot of experiences. And the more we do that, the more we create shared ownership for the outcome. If I only design something that fits my experience, it's limited. So we need to make sure to create true shared ownership in organizations. We bring all of those experiences together. So again, thank you for bringing some answers to the polls. We'll look at those for a little bit. And again, hopefully, as we're going through these seeds of bias, you're starting to see some familiarity with them. You might think, oh, I saw that at a meeting just yesterday. I saw us go to the way we've always done something as opposed to really looking at a different perspective. I'm looking at now my project team and realizing it's been the same 12 people for 2 years. Maybe we need to mix up the project team. The way we select vendors may have been only through a small supplier team. Do we need to bring in different perspectives from sales or from research and development or another group to really look at those vendors differently? Again, through their experience. And do we have a way to poll our teams on their experience, whether it's a great place to work survey, an employee engagement survey? Are we tapping into how people are experiencing our organizations so that we can make plans to address that experience? So thank you for those poll questions coming in, and we will move on from experience bias to distance bias. Quite frankly, distance bias means closer is better than far away. I am much more likely, to borrow something from my next door neighbor than to drive across town to go get something. If I can get it close, I'm going to go with what's close, because the thought about going really far away, my brain doesn't like that. It wants easy. We like immediate gratification. We focus on short-term results above long-term thinking. And this is where it becomes really challenging. Let's say you have a remote team. You have a team that's spread out all over the globe, and yet a leader works in the same office as one of the colleagues. Typically, subconsciously, that leader and that colleague spend more time together. And because that colleague is right there, they may be the one being brought in to consult. They may be the one that gets more opportunity because they're right here. And it's easier for me to talk to my colleague, Nicole, because she's here, than wait on a different time zone for my colleague in a different part of the world to wake up. This distance bias allows us to really want to move fast, but have more immediate gratification. Another way of looking at this, excuse me, is if given the choice between receiving $100, 100 euro, whatever currency, some good sum today. But if you wait till tomorrow, you'll get $50 more, 50 more euro. Most people will wait till tomorrow. Well, if I only have to wait one more day and I get a larger sum, I'll wait till tomorrow. But what if I said the choice becomes $100 today versus $150 3 months from now? Well, that doesn't seem like such a good bet. I might really want to still take that smaller sum today just because it's more immediate. Now imagine what Mihwa said in the introduction, and we're talking about a journey of 300 years. If you were to present to your leaders, this is something that's going to take quite a while, they might say, oh my gosh, that's so far away. So what do you do? Because the fact is, we need to make that timeline shorter, right? We need to make sure that we are making progress along the journey. Because if we put things too far away, a lot of times our brains say, oh, That's too far. I'll just, I'll take whatever we can get today and just focus on short-term thinking. So our brains like short-term thinking over long-term investments. So what do we do about that? To mitigate this kind of bias, we have to take distance out of the equation. We have to evaluate the outcome or object as if it were much closer in space, time, or ownership. So the fact is, if the journey is 300 years at the rate we're going, what do we do to set up more incremental milestones or accomplishments or processes that we know we can achieve along the path? So we take it from being something that's very far away to something we could do today. What's something you could do today that would help move this conversation forward? What's one meeting you can have or one conversation you can have? And all of a sudden, something that feels far away starts to feel closer. This orients us to the full value of whatever it is we're trying to achieve: gender equality, anti-racism, more philanthropy within our organization, better ESG results if you're an ESG organization. We still must consider time and physical distance as factors when making decisions, but those elements should factor into the decision consciously. If we live too much unconsciously with this, that bias of something far away might lead us to a short-term, weaker conclusion. So, when you think of distance bias, which causes us to favor short-term wins, how does that disrupt gender equality efforts? If our brains really love that short-term, immediate gratification. So again, with this bias, it really is about making things feel closer in space or time. And we do that by saying, here's how we're going to get from A to B. If we focus only on Z, the end state, which could be far away, really feels that we're not really up for that journey. So we really need to break down something far into something more manageable. That's why we like milestones, progress reports, weekly meetings. These things help us break things down into smaller components and allows us to set targets. All right, so moving on from distance to the last of the seeds of bias is safety bias. Frankly, safety and comfort are most important to us. And this one makes a lot of sense. Very few people challenge this bias. But where it becomes dangerous is certainly safety bias that says, I shouldn't go down that dark path. I may trip and fall. I shouldn't go in places where, I'm unfamiliar. I could be lost. Our brains tend to be risk averse in that way, and it keeps us safe. But unfortunately, it also wires us to believe that the known old way is safe and comfortable. And that wires us to avoid threats, including social pain. So for a leader who has to embark on a potentially uncomfortable conversation around bias, as an example, it could feel unsafe if we don't present this in a way that feels safer, right? Bad is a stronger emotion than good. Negative information tends to be more salient. Negative information tends to be more powerful and motivating than positive information. If you found money on the street, that's a good feeling. If you lose money on the street, that's a bad feeling. And that loss of the money is going to be a more powerful emotion than finding something. So how do we combat safety bias? To mitigate safety bias, you can conduct conversations that add psychological distance to the decision. So if something feels risky, we need to expand this territory. We need to bring in more vendors. We need to look at supplier diversity, and we need to look at our supplier group differently. That feels so risky for leaders because they think, but these suppliers are working. Why would I change something that feels safe, comfortable? We have to really create that psychological distance, and we do that through process. Well, what will be the way we evaluate these suppliers? We certainly don't want to make foolish decisions. We want to make thoughtful decisions, but at some point we have to make something feel safer. Imagine you're giving advice to someone in your shoes rather than making the decision on your own, right? That helps. Taking yourself out of it, bringing other people in who may not see the risks the same way you do. It can help you. Sometimes imagining that the decision has already been made and you're seeing it at a later point in time helps us understand what's the worst that can happen. How might we want to think about this differently? And so when you give something a more objective, distanced perspective, those events feel less emotional. They feel less emotional. So, safety bias. This causes us to avoid threat and risk. How does that disrupt our gender equality efforts? As you think about gender equality conversations you are having every day within your organizations, do they unintentionally pose risk to people? Do you find leaders feel that, oh, this could threaten something? And again, those feelings often exist on a very subconscious level. These aren't necessarily what they're consciously telling you. They believe in it. They know that it's the right thing. And yet there could be some perception of risk. There could be some perception of change. So, how does safety bias disrupt our gender equality efforts? And again, as you're thinking about how it disrupts, another thing to think about is then, well, how do we make it feel safer for everyone? All right. So we move on from safety bias. An overall general perspective here on managing bias. So, as you identify and mitigate biases in your own organization, keep 4 general principles in mind. Bias is universal, it lives in brains, and there are brains, billions of brains all over the world. It's universal. It is difficult to manage for bias in the moment you're making a decision. It's exceptionally difficult. We have to have more stages or more decision points that allow for the bias to be challenged along the way, because in the moment, I'm going to go with fast, safe, comfortable, in group. I'm going to go with all of those biases. They're going to force me to think quicker. Individual effort is not enough. We have to cultivate an organizational wide culture that puts in processes that force us to stop and pause. And in designing bias countering processes and practices, we need to encourage those that place a premium on the effort, on the analysis, on the data gathering, on the insights, on the focus group, rather than ones that go with just what feels right. So, as we talked about, we think these biases don't show up, they do. And as we know that there are biases that we hold, that we have. And I'm going to walk you through a way that a bias cycle kind of grows. Let's talk about an assumption or bias that somebody might have. A working mom might have an easier time working for another working mom. Now, what do we know? That could come from similarity bias, that could come from experience bias. I could have had a bad time with a boss, and now I have this bias. It activates thoughts. People think, well, I wouldn't get any sympathy for the demands of raising my kids if my boss doesn't have any. And now, consciously, do we know that there are exceptions to this rule? Of course we do. And yet, how powerful is that bias if it's something we've experienced? That thought becomes a story. I'm sure I'll be passed over for opportunities because my boss wouldn't think I can handle it. And ultimately, it's the story we tell ourselves that drives the behavior. It's not worth the risk to apply for a job if the boss doesn't understand my life. I use this example because it was an example from my own experience. I really did believe as a working mom, as a new mom, it would be easier if my manager had children because she would have more empathy. Now, consciously, I know there are exceptions to that rule, and yet it was a bias I had. What if you find you are in the middle of your own story cycle and you are grounded in something that may or may not be true? We must challenge at every step of the journey. What I did to combat that bias is I talked to colleagues and friends who were in roles where they worked for managers quite differently, out group, right? I was afraid to work for somebody in my out group. I talked to friends who worked for people in an out group. I talked to my own potential leaders about their perspectives on work-life balance, and I challenged that bias. And luckily I did, because I certainly wouldn't have come to my current company if I still had that bias, because I started working for somebody who was in my out group, a male leader in a different country. On paper, it looked like we had nothing in common, but I'm glad that I challenged that bias. And we need to challenge our teams. If you feel your team is stuck in a story cycle, is this real fact, or are we just telling ourselves a story about what we think is true? The other way bias becomes visible is through microaggressions or micro inequities. A micro inequity is a comment or action that demeans or marginalizes somebody. It's a slight. It could be, I'm on my phone when you're talking to me and I'm not listening to you. It could be that I avoid looking at you or acknowledging you in a meeting, or maybe skipping over you. A microaggression is a comment or action that negatively targets a marginalized group of people, so it becomes more damaging and more detrimental. Both are harmful to relationships and both erode our efforts toward inclusion or belonging. Maybe it's only acknowledging the men in a meeting. Maybe it's assuming that the female will take all of the notes. Maybe it's not inviting out people to the meeting who have a different perspective. But all of these little things become ways and signals to our own bias. So the impact of micro messages is that they demonstrate exclusion. So exclusive comments could be not being present with others, being on your phone, being distracted. Um, I, as a female leader within organizations, have been asked quite often when I travel, oh, who's with your children? I don't see those same questions asked to my male colleagues. These are inequities. These are questions that are different depending on the gender, the race, the age of a person. So there are all sorts of examples. And as you think about these now, maybe you can spot some from your own life. What are those things, those micro messages that you may see? A simple one, but when I had children, the places to change your child or the facilities that allow you to care for your child were in women's restrooms only. And I'm seeing that change now, which is a good thing because these are small, subtle things, but they basically make people feel excluded. And what we say is that this feels like death by 1,000 paper cuts, little tiny things, not a big thing. But if your organization, if you look at you and scan your organization and you see examples of these micro inequities, they are very damaging. And we have to be able to be willing to address them when they see them come up. On the flip side, there are something called micro affirmations, and these are positive. These are delivered through little micro messages, consciously or subconsciously, that demonstrate inclusion. So rather than asking a colleague, are you married? Which assumes that married people are the in group, right? That's a micro inequity. I might simply be broad and say, tell me about yourself. Remembering details of somebody's life. Do they have children? Do they not? What are their ages? Is there a special holiday that they celebrate? And you acknowledge that and you ask about that. These are little things. And certainly avoiding assumptions. Avoiding assumptions like, are you married? Do you have children? We assume things about people based on those first thoughts, that similarity bias. And oftentimes it makes people feel excluded. They may assume positive intent, but it's better to keep things very general when we're interacting with people and make sure that we're just not guilty. And if we find ourselves doing one of these micro inequities, the most important thing is to catch ourselves in the moment and say, I apologize. I'm sorry I pronounced your name wrong. I'm sorry I made that assumption. Tell me more about yourself. Because the impact of a micro affirmation is that people feel like they belong. And ultimately, that is what we want. We want to create safe environments for everybody to bring their whole selves to work. But again, as we've just discussed now, those biases are very strong and they wire us to have these behaviors that often subconsciously exclude people and include other people. And our organizations and teams are aware of this. So micro behavior awareness, here's some great things to do to really make sure that the micro behaviors are good. When welcoming a new member within a group, physically step back to allow them to have space in the group. Draw up a chair so they can be included. Really make sure that they are brought into the group, that they feel important, that they feel welcomed. Using affirmative gestures and body language, depending on your culture, depending on your region, there are ways that you can physically demonstrate warmth and encouragement when you bring people to the table and you ask for their contributions. Make supportive comments when new voices share in a meeting. Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate that. Thank you for your contribution. I didn't see it that way. That's a really interesting perspective. Those little micro affirmations, especially if you are a leader, you are a CEO, and you acknowledge a junior member of the team, are very powerful. And if you notice micro behaviors that persist in a group, provide feedback to that individual on their impact to the team. Micro affirmations drive engagement, retention, trust, and ultimately psychological safety. So now, as we kind of conclude the discussion of what bias is, and you've been given very high level overview of the way in which I've worked with companies to at least introduce this topic in. Keeping in mind this is part of a much longer workshop where we have groups interact and discuss with each other, the action plan becomes a very important step because the action plan says that simply knowing about this bias is not enough. That's a first thought, right? Well, I know I have bias. What can I do about it? There's many things we can do about it. Because if left unchallenged, your personal biases will, and maybe already do, affect how you do a lot of really important processes within your organizations, and particularly ones that have to do with other people. And so we need to challenge these biases. We need to make sure that we are putting processes in place that force us to pause, reconsider, bring new voices in. And again, if our brains struggle with that, it's okay. Be gentle on yourself, because this is a product of a lot of the things you've experienced. But our brains do have the capacity to change. So action planning strategies could look something like this. If a decision needs to be made on the team, then I will make sure that we bring the group together to have an open dialogue. So if something happens, I will do this. We're going to put processes in place that force us to slow down and really think about something. Now, the more that you do this, right, you'll start to find that we, as a team, as a group, still are able to move quite quickly. And why do I say that? When we use bias to make our decisions, often they are short-term, exclusive, sort of programmed decisions, right? And what happens? And we've all been there. We have to redo the work. We have to reanalyze. We have to bring everybody back together because the initial thing that we launched didn't quite hit the mark, right? So as teams build in more of these processes to pause, to consider, to analyze, ultimately things happen faster within organizations because we're not having to do that rework. And we're retaining our best talent because they feel that they belong and that their contributions are important. So bias cannot be managed individually. It has to be managed organizationally or within your group. If you're the only leader on your team committing to this conversation, it will be very difficult. So collectively, we have to acknowledge that it exists, talk about where it exists. So in the workshops I lead, I ask leaders to think about their own actual work groups. Where do you see similarity, experience, distance bias? Let's talk about it. It's real. And if we talk about it as if it's real, we can make a decision guide or strategy to combat it. Preventative measures. How do we keep those biases from being activated? Challenging our thinking, speaking up, bringing new voices to the table, welcoming them to the table, and asking for their contributions with an acknowledgement. Expand your network, develop your cultural intelligence. I have the perspective of a woman who's lived in the United States her whole life. I have to know that my experiences are limited to that. I need to bring other voices, other perspectives in to broaden my understanding of something and really find the best solution. And have an accountability partner, somebody who can check in with you. So, our call to action, we have to be more mindful. Our brains move very fast. Our days move very fast. We're full of a lot of information. So we need to think about mindfulness. We need to think about things we can do and build into our process. Maybe it's you're going to challenge yourself next week to get lunch with somebody in your organization who you haven't had a conversation with yet, just to get that different perspective. So it starts with individuals. As a team, we can hold each other to be accountable, to be more mindful. Also, I want you to challenge yourself to think about what you're already doing very well in this space. For many of you, you're a WEPs signatory because you are committed to this conversation. There is a commitment that you have demonstrated. And now we really need to think about, well, what could we do? What practices are we doing well? What steps have we already made? Right? That again, distance bias, something seems far away until we look and say, oh, we're actually farther along than I thought. We're not starting from the beginning. We're starting from a place of experience. And as leaders, you cast a very large shadow. A CEO or a president or an executive who commits a microaggression or inequity against somebody, that casts a very big shadow over that person. It really has a negative impact. And so we have to really be mindful of our own behavior. We have to be change agents, and we have to challenge ourselves. But there's certainly a lot of bias around bias training. If you're thinking about bringing bias training into your organization, a lot of times you'll hear things like, well, bias training alone does not work. Education alone doesn't work. That's absolutely correct. But what bias training does is it allows us to begin a conversation. It allows us to begin an essential conversation so that we can start making the necessary steps. That awareness is step one. So it's not nothing, but it's not everything. So we have to make unconscious bias training better. We need to strike a balance between limiting the defensiveness around unconscious bias while communicating the importance of managing it, right? People tend to get a little defensive sometimes. Oh, I'm not doing this, or I'm more aware of it, and that's a very natural reaction. So we have to strike that balance. We need to create a safe place for us to talk about it. And we need to structure the content around workplace situations. I've given you very broad examples. The power of a conversation like this is bringing these concepts to your organization and framing them around the decisions you're making every day. Now, we're making this decision. How might one of these seeds of bias be disrupting us? Let's really challenge ourselves and recognize those who call to mind these things and work together to make a plan for it. It has to be action oriented. This isn't a class just about thought alone. It's about how we take those thoughts and turn them into different actions. But ultimately, it is a commitment to consistently evaluate and innovate organizational processes that allow for the systems, including the systems that allow for bias in the first place. If we don't have a consistent way to interview people, bias is probably happening. If we don't have a consistent way to select our board members, in-group similarity experience bias may be happening. We need to look at the systems that allow for bias in the first place. We don't challenge these things. We've never challenged these things. And we have to look at those systems first, again, organizationally, and look at the ones that will have the most sustained impact on achieving our diversity goals, which is ultimately what we are all here to do. And as we know, this is a long journey. I say a journey of 1,000 miles. It could be a journey of 300 years. But we'll say a journey of 300 years begins with a second thought and a first action. And again, that is where your power lies. When that biased thought comes up and you think, oh, I don't like that, or I like that, or we should do this, taking that just extra moment to say, why did I think that so quickly? Is there another voice that I should bring into this conversation before I march ahead? Is there a second opinion, another perspective that will help me feel more confident about the direction that I'm going in and make sure that all voices have been heard? So with that, I will conclude my part of the presentation and turn it back over to the team.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That's been amazing. I'm going to quickly share my screen. So Nancy, so thank you so much, Nancy, for this amazing presentation. I've learned a lot, and I hope the participants are learning a lot too. And thank you so much for the participant for participating in the poll, so we can capture your voices as well, and we'll be sharing those later on. With that said, Nancy, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Would you mind taking them after my presentation? So you can take a sip of water. I know you've been talking a lot. But with that said, let me go over quickly to my part. So here are some of the resources that the web signatories can use to step away from your first thought and really make a difference in your second action. So we've selected a couple of tools for you. So I saw that many of the participants today here are coming from HR and even DI team, and also you've given many examples of the biases based on recruitment. So I think this first resource may be a particular interest for many participants today. We have this gender responsive recruitment checklist. It has been developed to guide companies to practice gender responsive recruitment. This can be used by recruiting firms, headhunters, and also for in-house HR department to ensure that the company's recruitment process is gender responsive. So you can see and find it on our website. However, this is only available to web signatories. So you may have to log in and you can access this resource later. And then we also have a guidance note on intersectionality. So many opportunities exist for companies to address all forms of discrimination in the workplace, marketplace, and community to ensure that the perspectives and talents of women in all their diversity are equally valued. So this guidance note provides some illustrative examples from and also definition of what is intersectionality and how does it affect your business, to some recommendation for companies to address discrimination and foster diversity, equality, and inclusion with a special focus on intersectionality. This is open for all, so web supporters, you can access this as well. Lastly, I'd like to introduce a case study on gender responsive procurement. It aligns a lot with how Nancy was describing. You're sourcing from your familiar vendors due to your biases and past experiences and etc. So this can be an example of sourcing outside of your comfort zone by sourcing from gender responsive companies. So this case studies examines some challenges and lessons learned from the pilot participants of this web's gender responsive procurement assessment tool results from a pilot we have conducted with global watch and jewelry industry. So these resources are available on webs.org. So please visit when you have a chance. So I'll quickly hand it over to Nancy so she can answer questions. So let me share the question for you. I know this is a little impromptu, Nancy, but
No, that's fine.
no, it's really good that we have the session so we can talk to you. So we have two questions from Radhika. She was asking, first, can experience bias also happen due to the fear of asking questions or fear of being judged or seeming to appear too critical? So you simply assume and second, guess the reason and make decision. Secondly, she was asking, how is distance bias different from experience bias?
Excellent question. So experience bias, absolutely, I think can happen because we are in the moment, don't want to be accused of being too difficult, right? Especially women. I don't want to ask a lot of questions. I want to make sure that you know that I'm easy to work with, right? And we have a need to be accepted by the group. So challenging, questioning, tend to be behaviors that we don't do in those moments. And so again, when we say these biases cannot be managed in the moment, I just want to get the conversation over with. I want to make the decision. So we have to make sure that we are putting processes in place to say, hey, you know, on our team, before we come to a conclusion, we make sure we put it through this kind of analysis, right? So as we, you know, dive in, I'm going to, you know, ask you a series of questions to make sure that we're covering all of our bases. And so again, those processes, those things that we put in that allow for better decision making to happen, it's not Nancy asking a lot of questions, it's our team's commitment to inclusive ideas that's asking a lot of questions. And you start to see how these biases all work in tandem, right? They don't fire off one at a time. So similar, like with distance bias, absolutely. So if experience bias is I go with what's available, right? And distance bias says I like short-term wins. The two together are really powerful, right? So distance bias just says, and again, I use Mihwa's perfect example of the 300-year journey. I don't know that I'm up for a 300-year journey. Okay, well, are you up for a 30-day journey? I can do a 30-day journey. Now, here's what that will look like. Over the next 30 days, we are going to host several focus groups. We are going to start a listening journey. Now, all of a sudden, I'm on the path to 300 years. And if I do enough of that, I've shortened that quite a bit for my own organization. So yes, these two are very similar. Expedience bias, I want to move fast. Distance says, I want immediate gratification. So if moving fast allows for immediate gratification, that's the answer for me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nancy. And I have last question. This is personally interesting to me. How do you manage people that deny to have unconscious bias, and how do you work together with these people?
Yeah, it is one of the most challenging things when you would start to embark on education is that immediate kind of resistance. There's something called a SARA curve, SARA. What that stands for is shock, anger, resistance, acceptance. And so there can be an immediate shock. What we try to do within the workshop is to diffuse that greatly. We do not want people to feel bad about having bias. We don't want them to feel badly about having something that's very biological. So when I tell people, hey, you know, your brain that so quickly identified chocolate cake as dessert is the same brain that also believed that that person was the secretary. It's how our brains work, right? So on one hand, the chocolate cake, probably not disruptive. Assuming, you know, gender of certain roles, pretty disruptive. So what we have to do within organizations, and again, this is why this is not an individual journey. If we relied on the commitment of every individual alone, we're really not going to get there. Collectively, we have to have processes that allow for bias to be challenged. As an example, if it was personal commitment alone, then the committed manager would use an interview guide before they hire a person, a consistent, validated, unbiased interview guide, right? And we would make that a choice. Only the managers who want to can use it. Everybody else can do what they want. If we make that a standard across the organization, across the team, now it doesn't simply rely on individual commitment. It says, if you work within our team, here are processes that we have put in place that everybody uses, because guess what? It just allows us to make better decisions. And part of the challenge is to evaluate that, and that's where a little bit of time to make sure that we can demonstrate that return. This investment gets this better result. What is our brains like? Good results. Our brains like that. So that would be my thought on that.
No, thank you so much, Nancy. So now I'll hand it over to Anna Feld, Global Head of the WEPs Global Secretariat, to share some reflection and closing remarks. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Mihwa and Nicole, and thank you so much to Nancy. It's been a fantastic hour. I also would like to thank all the participants, because the comments, the reflections that have been shared has been really, really amazing. And I've been watching the comments and the questions, and I think we are getting somewhere. So I want to go back to what you said in the beginning, Nancy. We have the ability to rewrite the story. And we've been talking, I don't know how many times we have mentioned the 300 years that it will take for us to achieve gender equality. But we can make a difference. We can, if we all absorbing what we've learned today, we can make a difference and rewrite another story, a story of feminism, a story of gender equality, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And I hope that that's why you're all here today, to help us rewrite this story. We organized this session because we thought that this is really the fundamental to be able to work on gender equality and to really understand what is behind all the biases and stereotypes that we are observing every day in our workplace, in our families, in our communities, and how we can address those. And I think, Nancy, today you have given us a really good action planning tool with ideas for what each of us can do, both individually, but more importantly, as organizations, but as a society as well. And that's why we are bringing WEP signatories together to work as a collective, to work as an ecosystem to drive this change. And I think you mentioned a few skill sets that we need to have. And I think one is to be disruptive. That's what I heard from you, to not accept the status quo, to be curious and ask a lot of questions, and be mindful, and not assume and ask a lot of questions. Questions are very important, and we've seen a lot of questions today in the chat, and thank you everyone for that. Linked to bias are social and gender norms. Social and gender norms are basically socially and cultural principles that govern the expected behavior of women and men, girls and boys. And we internalize these very early in our lives: how we dress, where we work, what roles we have, who can be leaders, who take care of the children, who can be aggressive, sensitive, or empathetic and emotional. These are things that we need to kind of reflect a little bit more on and say, is it only men? As Nancy shared a lot of statistics about who are currently CEOs. And we saw that in the Fortune 500, there was a huge majority of CEOs being white male. We have to change this to open our minds to who can be a CEO and encourage women around us to take on these roles and tell them, yes, you can do it. So this story circle that Nancy was talking about, help them challenge each and every step of that to say, you can become a CEO, you can become somebody in the C-suite, management team, etc., or you can be a board member. Gender norms shows up in the workplace, in the marketplace, and the community. So in all three pillars of the Women's Empowerment Principles, you will see these biases, and you have an opportunity to address them. Nancy talked a little bit about some of the workplace challenges that we have. We often talk about sticky floors and glass ceilings. These are the kind of perceptions and biases that lead us to leave women, the sticky floor concept, leaving women at the lowest positions, low paid jobs. And it's the glass ceiling is the one that determines whether women have those opportunities to become managers and leaders within the company. So take to heart the seeds. They might be some crossover and not clear. I saw some question where how do you distinguish between the different ones? Bottom line is that there is a lot of bias that dictates and determines who we recruit for a position, how we make that decision of recruiting. And I think in the gender responsive recruitment checklist that we have shared in the chat, we have outlined some ways to open up the mind towards other possibilities of recruiting. We hear often from our signatories that where do we find the women? We have a very low rate of women in our company. Where do we find them? And this checklist gives you a little bit of a starting point to address those. It is about opening your mind, and I think that comes to the, Nancy, I'm not going to say something wrong here, but to the distance bias, where basically you might just go for the closest, the pool of candidates from the closest university if you're hiring for new talent. Or you might have experience bias and basically just go on what you normally see and what you experience being good board members, for example. So all of this plays out in the workplace and also in the marketplace. We have, as you may know, the Stereotype Alliance that focuses on removing bias and stereotypes in marketing and advertising, because that's what make people believe that there is a certain norm in society that this, if you look at a commercial, for example, for detergent, you might see more likely a woman standing on the side with the detergent than you see a man. So these are the kind of things that we can really challenge and see how we can go about this differently. And the same thing with experience bias. I saw somebody was asking, do we now need to fire the people that we have in our teams or in our groups or maybe as a supplier? It is not about excluding people. It's about putting another chair on the table. So what we have recommended, for example, in the guidance note on gender responsive boards is that if you have term periods and you need to stick with those that period of term for that board member, maybe just add another chair so that there's some diversity coming in. Or in the team, try to see if you can recruit another person to the team to kind of mix up and make the team more diverse. So it's not about excluding, it's not about leaving anyone behind. It is about being more inclusive and trying to find solution to that. So I think finally, there has been a lot of questions about, are we recording this? Yes, we are recording it. We are recording it for you because you can listen to this many, many times and absorb this again, this information. But also encourage all of you to take this information in conversations into your companies, to have those conversations and lead those conversations. And maybe there will be, I think, if I understood correctly, Nancy, the acronym was SARA, the shock, anger, resistance, and acceptance. And you might see a lot of shock in the beginning, but if you do this on a recurrent basis, maybe those conversations will lead to acceptance and we will eventually be able to get over this 300-year journey and shorten it to Nancy's 30 days journey, which would be much, much better. So I would like to leave it at that. And I'm glad I've seen many comments, Nancy, that this has been extremely useful, thought-provoking, and I will hand it over to Nicole to close off and end with a survey, if you could please help us to get some feedback to this session. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna, for those amazing reflections. And as she mentioned before closing out, we'd like everyone to please help us fill out this evaluation and let us know how we did today. So a big thank you for those who could be here. And again, for those who are unable to join, you can find the recording and the resources that we mentioned in WEPs.org. And we hope to see you again in the future. Please keep an eye out on your inboxes for an event that we have scheduled around the third week of January. And again, thank you so much to Nancy and for everyone for participating today. Please take care.
Thank you. Here. We're going to wait a little bit so we can capture that evaluations, and then we'll be closing it about 30 seconds. We're finishing just on time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great one. Thank you.